The chief of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, reported to Putin that Russia had captured Kupiansk. Once again, he was telling stories about the mythical successes of the Russian army at the front. Ukrainian soldiers confirmed that the situation is difficult. Russia is not infiltrating the city, but in reality does not control a single district. Kristina Dombrovskaya will tell you more in detail.
Kupiansk is under the control of Ukraine's defense forces. Counter-sabotage operations and special actions to search for and eliminate enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups are ongoing in the city and its surroundings, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The situation is similar in Yampil. Our troops continue search and strike operations in the area of this settlement. Claims about the alleged capture of 80% of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region and 70% of the city of Pokrovsk are also not true. This is stated in a statement by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Facebook. Even the so-called Russian war correspondents do not believe the statements of the chief of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, about the alleged capture of Kupiansk. One of them called such statements putting the cart before the horse. The propagandist wonders where the 18 battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces, allegedly surrounded in Kupiansk according to Gerasimov, have gone. Gerasimov once again presented to Putin the victory map and the encirclement of the Ukrainian armed forces in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. The chief of the General Staff's statement about the complete liberation of Kupiansk and that around 15 battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces were allegedly blocked around Kupiansk-Uzlovoy is, to put it mildly, shocking, the Visionary Channel protests. From a publication by the Moscow Times, Putin's propaganda is spreading reports about the alleged encirclement of Ukrainian defense forces in the Podoli area. But Ukrainian fighters clarified that their units searched for Russian occupiers in those areas and did not find them. The soldiers of the 10th Army Corps stated that they will do everything to ensure that Russia's so-called victories remain nothing more than fantasies of the Kremlin. Earlier, Gerasimov had already reported to Putin about the alleged capture of Pokrovsk, as recalled by the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kyrylo Budanov. At the same time, he noted that the situation in the city was critical and they had to deploy a group of fighters by helicopter directly into the zone of intense fighting. Pokrovsk is of great importance to the Russians, which is why Russia is throwing a lot of forces in this direction, Budanov emphasized.
Why was it necessary to deploy paratroopers by helicopter? Because the situation was extremely tense and aggravated. Nothing else would have worked. What we did allowed us to win precious time so that the main units of the Ukrainian armed forces could approach the city to reinforce it, so to speak. After that, everyone in Russia stopped saying that the city had been taken. They started saying that there was progress, there was success, and that there were many battles going on in the city. Kyrylo Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, in an interview with Channel 24.
The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces reminded that Russian propaganda had allegedly already taken journalists a month ago to supposedly controlled locations in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. However, such statements are merely a Kremlin ploy intended to conceal critical losses.
This situation pertains to the current state and tactics of the Russian army, specifically regarding the strategy being implemented by the occupying forces. At present, there is no discussion or indication of any operational encirclement taking place. In fact, even the Russian occupiers themselves have openly acknowledged and admitted that such an encirclement is not happening. This clearly shows that any claims about an operational encirclement are not based on reality and are not supported by the facts as they stand. In particular, the Russian military blogger Kalashnikov says that there is no talk of any encirclement of Pokrovsk, and at the moment the occupiers are using the same tactics of street fighting as they did during the battles for Bakhmut, suffering enormous losses in personnel.
Ukraine's defense forces are trying to disrupt the logistical routes of the Russian occupiers. This was written on Facebook by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky. He once again visited the Pokrovsk direction and assured that Ukrainian defenders continue to carry out their tasks in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration area. In particular, they are working on strengthening their own logistics. The head of the main intelligence directorate and the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov, noted that Russia claims to have plans for the complete occupation of Donetsk region in the spring of 2026. But that's unrealistic, he said.
Ukraine's Special Operations Forces have for the first time shot down a Russian Mi-8 helicopter with a long-range drone. According to the military, this happened over the village of Kutenikovo in Russia's Rostov region, which is almost 200 kilometers from the line of contact. To destroy the helicopter, Ukrainian defenders used a long-range FP-1 drone. Ukraine's defense forces continue to repel Russian assaults and thwart all Kremlin plans to capture Pokrovsk and other cities. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, there have already been 112 combat clashes on the front since the beginning of the day. More details about the situation on the front line are coming up in the report.
Ukrainian soldiers have shown the complete rout of a mechanized assault by the Russian army near Mala Tokmachka in the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians threw tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers into the battle. As the soldiers note, 8 pieces of enemy equipment were destroyed and about 30 Russian servicemen were eliminated. Russian military personnel, another column of Russian motorcyclists attempting to storm the defense forces' positions in the Pokrovsk direction was stopped by Ukrainian border guards. The fighters accurately destroyed the enemy's vehicles and personnel. In addition, 2 armored vehicles were also hit. Military experts note that the defense of Pokrovsk is one of the main tasks.
In my opinion, it also serves another function. Today, through defensive actions and counterattacks, it is holding back a large enemy force, probably the largest among the occupying Russian troops, so that these reserves from Pokrovsk, for example, are not redeployed to places like Gorey-Polye. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in the past day, Ukrainian soldiers repelled nearly a quarter of all recorded Russian attacks on the Pokrovsk section of the front. This direction remains the most difficult one.
Putin's statement, in which he declared that he will come to Pokrovsk, that he intends to visit the occupied territory, something that Peskov specifically mentioned, along with the presence of such a huge amount of military personnel, aviation assets, weaponry, ammunition, and so on, is significant. This statement underscores the scale of the military resources and equipment involved, as well as the seriousness of the situation. And today, in general, they are crashing against our defenses.
The situation is also difficult in the Alexandrovsk, Gulyai-Pol, Konstantinovka, and Slavyansk directions. Ukrainian defenders also note that the enemy has become more active on the North Slobozhansky and Kursk bridgeheads. Armata. Ukrainian soldiers note that camouflage nets not only help hide weapons from the enemy's eyes, but also catch Russian drones like fish.
These are enemy drones that flew over our positions. The Russians wanted to bomb our position and started with these FPV drones, but it so happened that these FPV drones did not explode. That is, our position was camouflaged, we stretched camouflage nets, and several drones simply got tangled in these nets along with their munitions and did not detonate. I'm sure that if we run out of our own drones, we'll just launch these back at them.
According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, more than 200 Russian drones were shot down at the front in a single day. In addition, over the past day, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed 4 Russian tanks, 7 armored vehicles, 9 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher, and 1 Russian air defense system, as well as eliminated 1,170 invaders. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine have exceeded 1,163,000 soldiers. The United States has made an exception to the sanctions against the Russian Federation for Hungary. This concerns a license issued by the U.S. Treasury Department, which allows Budapest to conduct financial transactions with Russian banks as part of the construction of a nuclear power plant. The license covers transactions involving Gazprom Bank, VTB Bank, and the Central Bank of Russia. They have been supporting the project since 2014. Which is being implemented by the state corporation Rosatom based on an intergovernmental agreement between Budapest and Moscow. Russia is recording a collapse in arms exports. This was reported by Ukrainian intelligence. According to their data, until 2022, the Russian Federation received about $14 billion annually from the sale of weapons and military equipment. But in 2024, revenues from this sector have plummeted catastrophically. Victoria Chistyukina will continue the topic.
The export of Russian weapons is one of the key tools of political influence as well as an important source of income. It is one of the main items of Russian exports alongside the fuel and energy sector. However, this year sales have collapsed to a historic low. The head of Rostov, Sergei Chemezov, confirmed this information. According to Ukrainian intelligence, by 2022, Russia was receiving about $14 billion annually from this export sector. But in 2024, revenues dropped to $1 billion.
According to estimates by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, Russia's share of the global arms market in 2024 shrank from 21% to 7.8%. The geography of deliveries is also narrowing. From 47 countries in 2018 to 2022, it dropped to 33 in 2024, with the majority being states in Asia and Oceania. The largest buyers, India, China, and Kazakhstan, are also reducing their purchases. This is according to data from the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine.
Despite statements by Russian officials about an alleged future recovery and an order portfolio of more than $60 billion, a significant portion of the contracts is unconfirmed and depends on clients with low solvency. Without Russian credit support, these agreements remain more political declarations than actual exports.
At the Dubai Air Show 2025, Rosso-Boron export brought 850 items, but almost all the latest models turned out to be mock-ups. This demonstrates the depth of technological lag and the lack of combat-ready products. The consequences are obvious. The Russian defense industry is losing markets, technologically degrading, and becoming increasingly dependent on customers from Africa and the Middle East. In the near future, the decline in exports will only accelerate. Data from the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine.
The Russian economy continues to lose stability amid the protracted war against Ukraine and international sanctions. Restrictions against Rosneft and Lukoil, which have paralyzed more than half of oil exports to Asian countries, threaten further losses. Due to the drop in prices for Urals crude and discounts that have exceeded $20 per barrel, the Russian treasury will miss out on about 300 billion rubles in oil and gas revenues in November and December, according to Russian economists, reports the Moscow Times.
Restricting the ability to trade with the entire world in today's conditions, no country can develop normally without having a whole system of economic connections with its partners in various formats. Then on the other hand, it means that the aggressor does not have the opportunity to obtain funds on the external market. Therefore, what remains for the Russian Federation is to somehow try to mobilize its internal reserves. And even in such a large country as the Russian Federation, compared, for example, to Ukraine, these internal reserves are quite limited.
Recently, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that he will soon make a decision on powerful sanctions against Russia, which will be stronger than any previously imposed. Let us recall that the United States of America is preparing a new bipartisan bill to increase sanctions pressure on the Russian Federation. And Donald Trump has approved it. This was stated by U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. According to him, the document provides for expanding the powers of the president. This will allow Washington to punish countries that continue to buy cheap Russian energy resources and, in effect, finance Russia's military campaign against Ukraine.
No matter what Russia says, sanctions are working nonetheless. And for example, all those discussions that took place in 2022 to 2023, sanctions are helping us, we're developing import substitution and so on. Today, they are practically not working anymore.
Key sectors of the Russian economy are showing a decline, and the banking sector is preparing for possible government support to avoid a collapse. Back on September 4th, the head of Sberbank, Herman Gref, admitted that in the second quarter of 2025, economic growth in Russia had effectively come to a halt.
Western partners of Ukraine are paying special attention to discussing Trump's peace plan, stated British Prime Minister Keir Starmer while speaking to journalists at the G20 summit in South Africa. Commenting on the points of the document proposed by the US, he expressed concern about the restrictions for the Ukrainian armed forces. Today, Keir Starmer and Volodymyr Zelensky discussed the nuances of further diplomatic work by phone, and in the coming days, the British Prime Minister plans to speak with Donald Trump as well.
President Trump wants a just and lasting peace, and this is evident not only from his actions but also from the personal conversations we've had. It is important to note that one of the elements of the 28-point plan is security guarantees from the United States under Article 5 of NATO. This is perhaps the most reliable guarantee that can be offered. That is why I believe we are all striving for a just and lasting peace, but it will only be such if we remember that issues concerning Ukraine must always be resolved with Ukraine.
A compromise on Ukraine is still a long way off. This opinion was expressed by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz at the G20 summit in Johannesburg. He emphasized that the war can only end when Kiev gives its unconditional consent, as well as Europe, since this war is taking place on the European continent. The Chancellor also stressed that he had discussed this with the American president as well.
Shortly before my departure, I had a long phone conversation with President Trump. I made our position clear to him and also reminded him once again how Russia acted regarding the Budapest Memorandum. At that time, Russia had already taken on obligations towards Ukraine. When Kiev gave up its large arsenal of weapons, including nuclear ones, Moscow pledged to recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity in the long term but violated this commitment. That is why other security guarantees must now be provided. Other more reliable agreements need to be reached.
The current version of the peace plan is not final, the US president said in response to journalists' questions. Donald Trump noted that if Volodymyr Zelensky does not sign the document, Ukraine will continue to fight. At the same time, the president of Poland reminded regarding the current draft of the document that Russia does not abide by its agreements. American senators, both Democrats and Republicans, shared the same opinion. How the 28 points of the plan are being evaluated in the United States and Europe. The latest statements are in our next report.
The leaders of the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the G7 are ready to join the work on the US peace plan draft. This statement was published on the website of the European Council. A unified position was confirmed by the presidents of the European Commission and the European Council, as well as the leaders of 11 countries. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk also joined the statement. The leaders emphasized that they welcome the peace efforts of Donald Trump's team, and in the initial draft of 28 points, there are important elements, but this is only a foundation that requires further development. The EU statement also noted its unwavering support for Ukraine. We
are ready to contribute to ensuring the sustainability of future peace. We firmly adhere to the principle that changing borders by force is unacceptable. We are also concerned about the proposed restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces, which would make Ukraine vulnerable to future attacks. We reiterate that the implementation of provisions concerning the European Union and NATO will require the consent of EU and NATO members, respectively. From statements on the European Council website,
Ukraine's position and further joint steps with European colleagues have already been discussed by Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha. He emphasized that he had timely and substantive phone conversations with diplomats from France, the United Kingdom, Poland, Finland, as well as Italy and Germany.
We discussed in detail the elements of the peace proposals presented by the United States and our joint efforts on the path toward a just peace. I also emphasized the importance of continuing transatlantic pressure to force Russia to end the war and thanked our partners for their willingness to strengthen support for Ukraine at this critical time. Andriy Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, on Telegram.
The United States' proposal to end Russia's war against Ukraine is a real way to achieve peace, and President Volodymyr Zelensky should accept it. Donald Trump stated this during a press conference at the White House and set a deadline of November 27th. The American president is confident that this is an appropriate time frame for Kiev to agree to Washington's peace proposal. Trump emphasized that the war in Ukraine has already claimed many lives, with heavy losses on both sides. If Ukraine does not accept the US proposal, it will have to keep fighting.
We spoke with their people. We have a plan. What is happening is terrible. This war should never have happened. A cold winter lies ahead, and many major energy facilities have been attacked. We have a way to achieve peace. I believe we have a solution that Ukraine will have to approve.
However, the Trump administration's plan did not receive unanimous support even within the United States itself. A number of representatives from both parties in Congress criticized it. And Senator Mitch McConnell, the former Republican leader in the Senate, believes that Trump's circle is more focused on appeasing Putin than on ensuring a lasting peace.
Putin has spent the whole year trying to make President Trump look like a fool. If administration officials are more concerned with appeasing Putin than achieving real peace, then the president should find new advisors. Rewarding Russia for its brutality would be disastrous for America's interests.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance wrote on social media that critics of Trump's peace initiative simply misunderstand it, and that the plan is actually intended to stop the killing. It must be acceptable to both Kyiv and Moscow, and it should also increase the chances that the war will not resume. Meanwhile, in the United States Congress, signatures have already begun to be collected to bring a bill to a vote that would strengthen sanctions against Russia. This was reported by a Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Brian Fitzpatrick. According to him, this is how congressmen are responding to the deadline set by Donald Trump for Volodymyr Zelensky for a peaceful resolution. The petition mechanism allows a bill to be brought to the floor without the support of the leadership if it is signed by 218 congressmen.